Now that we've had a look at the political background of the region of Judea and environs in the beginning of the first century, I'd like to turn our attention to one specific biography that, of course, has tremendous significance for not only Jewish history, but world history. This is a topic that may attract a certain amount of unwelcome attention, and the comment box is going to be filled with a lot of unwelcome and unhelpful additions. And so if you see that I've turned off the comments, it means that I've just given up. And the video is really important to include in our discussion of the course of Jewish history in the ancient world, because obviously this was a turning point for much of world history that had phenomenal impact on Jews over the following 2 millennia. We certainly can't ignore this important chapter. So let us focus our attention today on the historical Jesus. Let's try to understand from a biographical perspective, from a historical perspective, who was this person? And how did he relate to his Jewish environment? It, of course, goes without saying that he himself was Jewish, that virtually all of his audience were Jewish, virtually everyone he interacted with was Jewish. It was only later in the next generation, with specifically under Paul in particular, that Christianity becomes much more of a Gentile phenomenon. That is something that the majority of adherents are not ethnically Jewish. But let's focus today on Jesus's own life, what we can glean about it, and then we're going to go to the post-Jesus period under Paul and later in the next video. Now, the quest for the historical Jesus is not a new one, and there are many attempts to try and figure out, based on the Gospels, what exactly we can say with certainty about Jesus' life. We should recall that the New Testament, that is the Christian scriptures, are quite different from the so-called Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. The Hebrew scriptures, which really constitutes kind of a national library of spirituality, goes covering hundreds and hundreds of years and has many, many different voices. Of course, in traditional Jewish thought, the first 5 books were dictated by God to Moses. There's a lot more to say about it, but not necessarily in this video. And then the subsequent volumes were all, inspired by God in some way, but have specific authors and are located in a particular time and place and context. The New Testament is rather different. It has, a tremendous amount of concentration written by a very small group of authors on a very specific single topic in one particular place and time in concentration. There are 4 distinct biographies of Jesus in the form of the 4 Gospels, for example. And then, of course, lots of material is gleaned from the later works that follow the Gospels. Of the 4 Gospels, the first 3 are called the Synoptic Gospels because they more or less kind of line up with each other. Not precisely. There are some difficulties, details that are added in some of the Synoptic Gospels, not in others, apparent contradictions between them. And so for hundreds of years, there have been attempts to try and create a single gospel based on those 3. The 4th gospel, that of John, is rather different. It has lots more material. It has a different tone in many ways. So out of these 4 basic sources, can we actually create a historical picture of Jesus? So lots of attempts have been made. One of the most interesting, I think, is that of none other than Thomas Jefferson, who created this book here. This is actually in his own hand, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted textually, as we shall see, literally from the Gospels. And here's what he actually did. He actually took a razor and edited out those passages that he felt were redundant or perhaps nonsensical because he didn't like miraculous events, and he tried to create a human biography by removing lots of excess material and by combining the Gospels to create one kind of coherent whole. Kids, I do not recommend you try this at home. It will get you in a lot of trouble if you take a razor to your Bible and try to remove passages from it. But nevertheless, this is a very difficult enterprise. What kind of sources can we bring to bear to try to understand the historical Jesus? So obviously we have the Christian scriptures, the earliest of which are the letters of Paul that you will note date after the death of Jesus. So we don't have any contemporary sources Although the Gospels and others may have been inspired, certainly were, by oral tradition, we don't have any contemporary sources. The earliest one that we have written down is something like 10 or 20 years written after the death of Jesus. Then we have a couple of passages in Josephus. We talked about one, the Testimonium Flavianum, the most important one in the last video. But the references on Josephus are less about Jesus and more about Christians, especially the ones written towards the end of his life. And then we have Tacitus, one of the Roman authors, with not necessarily a very charitable view of Jews and by extension of Christians. And again, just like passing references, not really very helpful to flesh out a biography. We have some fascinating material from non-canonical texts, like these Gospels of Thomas, of Mary, and of Peter that were discovered elsewhere. These are, for example, like we discussed with the book of Maccabees, texts that were not included in the Christian canon that formed the Bible, but were still circulating in antiquity. Then we have the Church Fathers, and of course, they have the disadvantage of being written so much later and essentially relying on the kind of materials that we still have preserved, and in some cases, perhaps material that has been lost. And finally, we have the Talmud that, again, is written much later, a few hundred years after the events described. And although they may rely on oral traditions as well, one of the important things about understanding the Talmud as a historical source is that the rabbis in the Talmud, it's not really fair to ask them to teach us history. They're trying to teach us religion, specifically Judaism, and so they're saying much about how Judaism views Jesus, again, at some distance and perhaps in an allegorical manner and so on. At any rate, when we pull those things together as best we can, this is what we have as a scholarly consensus. And note, I'm talking now about a scholarly consensus, not necessarily that of a believer. As we have with Jews who revere the Hebrew scriptures as inspired word of God in one form or another, the assessment of the validity and specifically the historicity of the texts we're describing for Christians depends a lot on how you approach those texts. So if we boil down to just what scholars agree on, they basically say the following. There's general consensus that Jesus was a historical person who actually lived somewhere between 6 before the Common Era until about the year 26 to 36 of the Common Era. And for those of you who may not have watched some of these previous videos, let me mention that the terms BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, generally replace before Christ and Anno Domini, BC and AD, because this is a term used generally by secular scholars or by non-Christian scholars. So please don't be offended by it. That is actually a scholarly norm. So we know roughly when he lived. We can patch these things together from, Roman records and other Judean sources and so on. We know that he spent his youth in Nazareth, which is in the Galilee region. We know that he was baptized by John the Baptist. And there's a lot of interesting things to say about the relationship between them, but again, not for this video. We know that he debated and taught religion and morality with other Jews primarily. And you can see in this map here some of his adult ministry in the region from Hebron in the south up to Sidon in the north. Most of his audiences were Jewish, although there were a few that were distinctly non-Jewish. There's also a discussion of his time in Egypt as a child, but his primary adult work is in Israel. And finally, he was crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate, the procurator who we spoke about in the previous lecture. That's basically what we know. What we don't know is huge, and specifically when we try to understand it in the context of his Jewish community, because he was a first-century Jew. How did his community understand what he was saying? We don't know, for example, what exactly was his relationship to the Torah and to Judaism. What was his relationship to the seething political ferment of the day? And what was his relationship to Jews vis-a-vis his relationship to non-Jews or gentiles? Really big questions. Let me give you a couple of examples of why we don't really know and what are kind of the parameters of the debate. Let us recall that the teachings of Jesus that we have today do not come to us unmediated from a first century Jewish source. They primarily come to us through Greek translations of what Jesus would have said. He would have spoken Aramaic, perhaps a little bit of Koine, which is kind of like a Greek, not exactly a dialect, but a form of Greek, let's say, that was common throughout the region. But the texts that we have are all in Greek. And when you translate a text, you ipso facto must distort it. And especially cultures so radically different as the culture of Athens and the culture of Jerusalem. We spoke about this a little bit when we talked about the Maccabean revolt. And actually, there's a video that I think I titled Athens and Jerusalem. It talks a little bit about how they see things differently. So just in one example, though, in Jerusalem, Jews understood the model of a prophet, the holy man who came with a rebuke from God and was sending a message, because otherwise God would get involved in history. Like, consider, for example, God speaks to Jonah and says, "Get thee to Nineveh in Babylonia and tell those people that they're going to be destroyed." And, there's a whole story there that's fascinating. Athens, on the other hand, has much of a model of the holy man who is a philosopher like Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, that is maybe distinct from the world, that contemplates the forms and the ideals and does not necessarily engage in the world and does not come with a burning message that God wants people to behave differently. So a lot of things that change as the authors of the texts in the New Testament convey these ideas to a Greek audience. Furthermore, who exactly is writing these things down, and do they have a specific agenda that is tied to who's listening? Paul in particular is especially important depending on who he is speaking to, and we'll look at a couple of examples. So trying to understand Jesus' teachings in Jewish context, let's look at those three areas that we identified a minute ago. First of all, on Torah and Judaism. In some passages in the Gospels in particular, you have debates between sometimes rabbis and Jesus about specific practices, such as, for example, hand washing. Now, if you are not familiar with Jewish practice and you're reading this cold, you would say, what? What is this? Why are they wondering if Jesus and his followers wash their hands before they eat? Doesn't everybody wash their hands before they eat? Are they insinuating he's not clean or something? Is this something about hygiene? Of course, if you understand it within the Jewish context, you know right away that they're not talking just about washing one's hands free of dirt. They're talking about whether or not Jesus submits himself to rabbinic law, in which there is a specific rule laid down, a halacha, that says that before you say the blessing over bread, you must wash your hands in a ritual format. Long discussion about why that is so. But it was really a marker of affiliation with the Jewish community and with the authority of the rabbis to agree to that practice. There's a famous passage in the Talmud in which Rabbi Akiva is imprisoned by the Romans after the Bar Kochba revolt, and he's only given a very small measure of water, and he insists on keeping some of that water aside in order to fulfill this particular commandment of the rabbis, because he respects rabbinic authority so much. So they're really not asking him about hand washing and about other issues like healing on Shabbat and so on, but they're trying to find out, like, are you part of the Pharisaic community, or do you submit to it, or do you not? And some of the answers that Jesus provides suggest that he is not. Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, things like that. On the other hand, there are passages like Matthew 5:17 in which he says, "I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." By the way, the law is one attempt in Greek to translate Torah. And of course, in a Hebrew context, Torah, which the root of which means the teaching, as it were, is much larger than the law. In fact, law in form of religion is a word that doesn't exist in Hebrew at all, at least not in biblical Hebrew. You have to use halakha, which means like the way, the path, the direction. The law is a novel idea that you have to use Greek to really express it. At any rate, so where is he? Is Jesus like rebelling against rabbinical authority, or is he trying to support it, perhaps in a revolutionary way? There's a lot of ambiguity, and scholars debate it. Secondly, what about his political ideologies? We talked about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the Zealots and so on. There's no question that Jesus is closest to the Pharisees, in the sense that, siblings will argue much more than strangers will, because siblings are closer and they care more about each other. And so it's not surprising to see that, there's a lot of Pharisaic debate with Jesus over things like washing the hands and so on. There are some points in the Gospels where Jesus appears to take positions that are very close to the Pharisees, such as, for example, the idea of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's, which seems to fit with the Pharisaic idea of, we are not going to defeat the Roman Empire. Let us just, pay our taxes and keep our heads down and occupy ourselves with our inner spiritual world. But on the other hand, he seems like a zealot, intent on disrupting the status quo, such as the dramatic moment in the temple courtyard in which he, overturned the tables of the money changers and things like that, which is, by the way, a widely misunderstood passage too. So that would be much more of a zealotry kind of thing to do. By the way, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of specific passages and what could they possibly mean, I'd highly recommend the Jewish Annotated New Testament, published by Oxford University Press, which has some amazing essays at the back, which kind of give an overall context, and then, of course, the entire New Testament with lots of fantastically useful footnotes that will be especially helpful if you're not familiar with the larger Jewish context. I, who am familiar with the Jewish context, but not so much with the New Testament environment, really enjoyed it as well. So politically, it's hard to place Jesus on the spectrum. Jews and Gentiles, it's fascinating. As I mentioned, the vast majority of people that Jesus interacted with, maybe less so when he went up to the region which is now Lebanon, but certainly in Judea, the vast majority of people he interacted with were Jews. What would he have said about Gentiles? We can read some things backwards from the later works. For example, a passage in Galatians 2, in which James, who is based in Jerusalem, is apparently placed in charge of gospel to the circumcised. And by the way, circumcised versus uncircumcised is sort of a binary that exists in Hebrew scriptures. So James in Jerusalem is in charge of speaking to Jews, and Paul is placed in charge of a different gospel to the uncircumcised. I mean, you presume it's a different gospel. And we see that there's some conflict occasionally about, well, like, how are these two populations supposed to interact? Should you have Jewish Christians, for example, sitting down at a meal with Gentile Christians, meaning Christian believers who are of non-Jewish ethnic origin? And what does that mean in terms of the larger question of observance of the law? Is Jesus talking about Christianity being Judaism plus, meaning that Jews should continue to observe the Sabbath, the dietary laws, circumcision, and so on, and this new teaching? Or is this something completely new that wipes out all of those requirements, especially for Gentiles, only for Gentiles, for everybody? These are really large and enduring questions that are difficult to answer given the expansive nature of the text in the New Testament. Let us now discuss the end of Jesus' life, which of course is extremely important for later Jewish history. This period is called the Passion, and what you're looking at on the screen here is a very powerful work by Marc Chagall, a European Jewish artist. It's called La Crucifixion Blanche, the White Crucifixion. And as you can see from just a cursory look, that Jesus is so clearly identified as a Jew. Surrounding the crucified Jesus is, on the left, you see apparently a Jew in a San Benito, which is reminiscent of the later Spanish Inquisition, and a Jew holding the Torah scroll who's fleeing for his life with a look of fear in his face. You see examples of Torah scrolls being desecrated and set to the flames, and women crying. Of course, this painting was created in 1938, a very momentous time on the eve of World War II. You see Jews as refugees in boats, clearly desperate. Perhaps evocative of the pogroms of 1919, you see maybe that's the Red Army there with the red flags coming over. Let me take myself out for a second. There's a scene here with a synagogue on fire and someone apparently reaching in to take the Torah It looks like he has an armband. I'm not exactly sure. And is this meant to be evocative of a Nazi, perhaps, to destroy the Torah? I don't know. But above Jesus' head, meanwhile, fly these angelic beings, and they're clearly distressed. Who do they represent? Jesus' ancestors, perhaps, his descendants, but clearly they're disturbed by the way in which not only Jesus is crucified, but all the suffering that has followed in its wake. My teacher in this period was a great scholar named Alan Davies at the University of Toronto, and he would speak about the Passion. He would emphasize how in basic Christian theology, this is really ground zero level, is that Jesus was not killed by the Jews. The Jews were not to blame for the death of Jesus, because that goes exactly the opposite direction of how the theology should evolve. The whole point is that Christ died for our sins. That's how it's placed in Corinthians and many other places. That Jesus died to save the entire world, right? The suffering servant, the paschal lamb, for God so loved the world. This is the message. To displace the blame for the death onto another people is exactly the opposite of what this passage means. Now, I am hardly a Christian theologian, but it seems to me that this sounds reasonable. We really see it, placed in Catholic law when we get to Nostra Aetate, which in the 1960s reevaluated 20 years after the Holocaust, what have we been saying about the Jews, and let's make sure that it's not misunderstood. For millennia, Jews have been haunted with the charge of deicide. That is the idea that Jews killed Jesus, the killing of God, literally, and this has been an extremely difficult aspect, really at the heart of Western anti-Semitism, and we will certainly come back to it in other contexts later. But let us focus, as we are now in this video, on the actual biography of Jesus. Let's try to understand how he was put to death and why. No question, scholars agree that the trial as presented in the Gospels is ahistorical. It does not make sense by what we know about Jewish law. It could not have happened as described there. For example, was he charged with blasphemy? Well, his trial does not in any way conform to how a Jewish court would work, how the Sanhedrin would work, even if they could mete out death penalties at this period. It just doesn't make sense. Was he tried for, political insurrection of some kind? Possible, but on the other hand, if that were the case, why wouldn't his followers also be killed? It's hard to reconstruct what actually happened from the accounts that we have in the Gospels. We can't say, however, that the text really emphasizes the way in which the Romans wanted to mock Jesus as a Jewish leader. As you can see here from this close-up in the Chagall painting, the Gospels describe how the letters INRI were posted above his cross, which stand for Jesus Nozri Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And Chagall wanted to underline this messianic aspect to it by writing Yeshu HaNotzri Malka Dehudoi, the Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews. I don't know if my opinion on this is worth very much. I'm not a specialist in this area, but it seems to me that there may have been some elements in the Jewish community who regarded Jesus as a troublemaker, as a rabble-rouser who was upsetting the status quo in an unhelpful way. He also clearly had a certain critical mass of followers that would later go on to build this world church that had such tremendous impact. But I get the feeling that this was primarily an act of Roman caprice, that he crossed the wrong person at the wrong time, and life was cheap in the first century. There were thousands of crucifixions of Jews, especially in this area, and that Jesus should stand out as receiving due process when so many other nameless victims did not, it stretches credulity. It's also important to note, by the way, that much of the description of the Passion that we receive from later sources offers considerable more detail, often with a much more negative connotation towards Jewish participation. And this is certainly correlated with the increasing gentilization of the church, meaning as the church becomes less and less of a Jewish family affair, as a Jewish mishpacha, so to speak, and becomes much more of a global movement that attracts Romans and Greeks and Scythians and whatever, that then it becomes much more of an us versus them kind of phenomenon. It's much easier to blame the them. Let me leave the passion, however, by discussing one last thing which is especially noxious and difficult for Jewish history, and that is the so-called blood cry. It's a passage that's recorded in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 25, in which, and again, this is very ahistorical, but Pontius Pilate, the procurator, says to the gathered Jews, I'm going to let you have one of my people slated for death go free. Would you like to have Jesus go free or Barabbas, who was a common thief? As the gospel describes, the people say, release Barabbas. And Pontius Pilate says, but that means I will kill Jesus. And the response of the Jews, which has been enshrined as this so-called blood cry, is the phrase, his blood be on us and on our children. Meaning, we Jews take responsibility, and so do future generations. Now, many scholars have argued that given when the Gospel according to Matthew was composed, probably immediately after the destruction of the temple, or perhaps in the context of the revolt, this is a reflection on the very next generation of Jews, meaning it's kind of like a prefigurement of what would happen a generation after Jesus was killed. Unfortunately, over the centuries, this has been taken as a justification by some for anti-Semitic violence, arguing that all Jews for all time have somehow accepted responsibility for Jesus' death, which is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, exactly opposite, 180 degrees, to a basic understanding of Christian theology, that Jesus died for all our sins, meaning Christians included, not blaming the Jews exclusively. But this takes me further away from history than I am comfortable, and let's conclude at this point. The next video is going to look at how the church evolved, and specifically how you have an increasing separation between the Jewish community in Israel, who wall themselves off from this new idea of Christianity, and how the new evolving Christian church changes from being an internal Jewish phenomenon to a much larger global phenomenon. Thank you very much for watching.